Recently, the new IOC president, Kirsty Coventry, caused quite a bit of controversy when she reaffirmed her belief that Olympic athletes should not receive prize money from the Olympic Games. As an athlete myself, I strongly disagree, but at the same time, I can understand where the argument comes from. So I wanted to break down exactly what happened, why it's controversial, and what the arguments are on both sides. I hope you enjoy. So, before I get into anything, I want to explain what actually happened. So, during an interview in New Zealand, Kirsty Coventry was asked about Olympic prize money, and she said that she did not believe in paying athletes. The backlash was obviously significant. She later released a statement clarifying her position. So, she doesn't believe Olympic medals should come with direct prize money from the IOC. She believes only a small number of athletes would benefit and argues that the IOC's role is to support a larger number of athletes throughout their journey, and says funding should be directed toward athlete development, Olympic preparation, and life after sport. So this is where the divide is. The debate isn't whether athletes should be supported. Everyone agrees that they should. The debate is whether athletes should share directly in the value that they create. And my personal position on the matter is that obviously I think they should. I think that any person, regardless of who you are, should be paid in proportion to what value you generate. If you generate value, you should be paid. The more value you generate, the more you should be paid. The less, the less. But I do want to summarize what they actually are trying to get across, what their points actually are in regards to not paying athletes directly out of the Olympics. So, the first point being only a few athletes would actually benefit. According to the IOC website, 90% of their revenue from the games goes straight back into sport and athlete development. And the Olympics has thousands of competitors, and if prize money is only awarded to medalists, most athletes receive nothing. Funding becomes concentrated among the very best, and the argument being, why would we give $100,000 to one gold medalist when that money could support hundreds of athletes coming through the pathway? Maybe not hundreds, but a good amount. The second point would be that the Olympics isn't supposed to be professional prize fighting. Historically, it was based around amateur sport. Amateur coming from the Latin amateur, which means lover, which just essentially means you do it for the love of it. Amateur means you are not getting paid. It was about competing for your country. And obviously things have changed now. Things are very, very different. The Olympics is no longer a place where training would be considered cheating. But now it's become more focused around pursuing excellence rather than financial reward. And the IOC would argue that the Olympics medal itself is the reward, which I can understand. I can understand how good it would feel to get an Olympic medal, but when that's the only thing that you get out of it, I'll make that a bit later. The third point that I could think of that they would make is that the money could increase inequality. What the IOC might argue is that wealthy countries already dominate and more prize money may widen that gap, and successful athletes become more successful while others get left behind. Which makes some amount of sense. If the gold medalist is getting paid $100,000, then they may be more likely to get another gold medal at the next Olympic Games. It makes some amount of sense. But the point I would make is that already happens to some extent, just not on the individual level, and more on the governing body sort of level. So I should explain, the national governing bodies widely get funding based on how they perform at Olympic Games for a lot of sports, especially in the UK world, because the amount of success that they get at an Olympic Games directly correlates to how much funding they get for their cycle for the next 4 years. If they do well, they get more. If they do less, they get less. So there is already some amount of success breeding more success within Olympic disciplines, within Olympic sports. British gymnastics, for example, which I'm a part of, not as a part of the governance of it, but I'm a gymnast for Great Britain, like not massively high level one, but high enough to know what's going on at a very surface level at least. British Gymnastics will always prioritize the Olympic Games first and foremost because the Olympic Games is what generates their revenue more than anything else. Therefore, if, say, there is a British gold medalist at the next Olympic Games, the British Gymnastics gets more revenue as a result, gets more funding as a result from UK Sport and from the National Lottery, which directly relates to them being able to produce more athletes, like more high-level athletes, because they can increase the level of the facilities, they can increase the support that they're giving their athletes, which increases the likelihood of a successive gold medal, which kind of goes against their point of wanting there to be less of a gap between the levels of the individual nations, when the individual nations can get more directly from their Olympic success anyway. So there's already a counterpoint, and that's not even going into the main reasons as to why many, myself included, won't believe in what they're promoting. So let's go into that a bit now. Why athletes are angry, essentially. So the first point, and probably the biggest one, is that there would be no Olympics without the athletes. The athletes are what make the Olympics the Olympics. Otherwise, it would be a bunch of stadiums with a bunch of equipment and nothing in them. No one doing anything. It would be boring, and there would be nothing going on. The Olympics doesn't exist without the athletes. People don't watch the Olympic headquarters and the IOC meetings and the committees. They watch the athletes. They watch people like Simone Biles, Noah Lyles, Leon Marchand. They watch these names because of the names, because of the level of sport that they produce, the level of performance that they produce. The athletes themselves generate the value, and yet many struggle financially. And the second point that directly ties to it is that the Olympic movement generates billions. After the last Olympic cycle, the IOC generated $7.7 billion in revenue. And after the last Olympic cycle, $65 million was paid out to 24 directors of the IOC, but then they refused to pay athletes directly. Yes, I understand that revenue is revenue and it's not profit. There are bottom lines that you gotta think about, and there are expenses. I understand that, but clearly they're making enough to pay out their directors a ridiculous sum of money, and the rest of it may not even be going to the right places. Because remember the 90% of the revenue going back into the sports and athlete development figure that I used earlier? Well, that may not be entirely accurate. Toyota, one of the biggest partners, they were one of the top partners of the Olympic Games, which had previously signed an $835 million deal, pulled out after the Olympics with the chairman stating that the IOC did not prioritize athletes and that the partnership no longer aligned with the company's vision of putting people first. We can't be certain about where the money is going. That speaks volumes, and that shows that potentially the IOC is more than just for the athletes. And it generates billions through the broadcast rights and the sponsorships and the licensing. And athletes are the only reasons that those revenues exist. And many athletes will feel that if the Olympics is generating billions, which it is, why shouldn't the people creating the spectacle, creating the revenue and the value, receive a share? Which would be a valid question. And that's not even going into what it takes to be an athlete and the athletes outside of the Olympics. This is just purely from a numbers perspective. If the Olympics paid out athletes, like every single one of the athletes, plus gold, silver, bronze bonuses at the Olympics, it wouldn't make a dent in their bottom line. And the sacrifice to get athletes to that level and to the point of going to the Olympics is enormous. And I can speak personally here about my experiences as an athlete, but you could talk to any athlete. I'm not the highest level. I've spoken to some, but the level of the Olympics is otherworldly, and the years of training and the countless injuries and missed opportunities and the career sacrifices that you have to make to be a professional athlete many times aren't worth the quote unquote reward that you can get out of being an athlete. Most Olympic athletes aren't becoming rich from sport. They aren't in the Olympics because of the money anyway. And changing it to the point, changing it so that Olympic athletes do receive something from the IOC would not change that. The risk reward ratio, the talent and the hard work that is required would not be worth it if people were just doing it for the sake of getting paid. You won't suddenly get random people trying to go into the Olympics because there's a financial reward out of the back of it, because it's near impossible to actually get to the level of going to the Olympics in the first place. Like, if you look at the number of athletes that go into sport versus the number of people that go to the Olympics, it's drastically different. So you may as well give the people that are there a bit of a reward for getting there. And this is all excluding the factor that other sports pay their athletes and pay them well. I mentioned that if you paid out athletes based on the attendance and then also gold, silver, bronze, you would, depending on the amount, obviously, but that's somewhere between 1% and 3% of the revenue that the IOC generates on a 4-yearly basis, on the cycle basis. The NBA has a 50% revenue share between the athletes. Athletes get 50% versus the maybe 3%, being very generous, that the IOC potentially would have to live with. It's almost unprecedented that the Olympics is really unusual because the athletes generate that huge value, but then don't see any direct return. And basketball isn't the only one. Things like football's renowned for it. Tennis, golf, UFC, other professional leagues. Like, there are so many sports that pay athletes and pay them well, but the Olympics seemingly isn't. And there is a counter argument to my own position. I do understand the concern that if you only reward medalists, you're helping a very small group of athletes. And I also understand that the funding of grassroots participation in athlete development is incredibly important. But I don't think those things have to be mutually exclusive. I don't think you have to have one and not the other. I mean, realistically, best case scenario, you would have both of those things. You would actually put the money back into athlete support and development and the pathways up, and you would actually put the money into athlete development funding, supporting pathways and helping athletes after retirement. But also you'd create a meaningful athlete revenue sharing model. You would reward Olympic medalists, you would reward finalists, and you would recognize the people that are generating the value, because that only seems fair. I understand that the people behind the scenes need to be paid as well. I understand they're doing a lot behind the scenes. I understand that there is a lot that goes on within the back end of sport in general and what the IOC will have to be doing. But when you generate that amount of revenue, you have to be very careful about where it goes. And again, the question isn't whether athletes should be supported. Everyone agrees that they should. The question is whether the athletes who create the Olympic Games should share directly in the success of the Olympic Games. And personally, I think the answer is yes. Let me know what you think in the comments below. But thank you for listening to the Game of Gymnastics podcast. I hope you've enjoyed. I know this has been a bit different where I haven't actually talked about gymnastics really at all within the podcast, but if you do like me, like my content, then feel free to subscribe or click the video on my left. Yes, on my left, if you like my content and want to see more. But thank you for listening. Leave a like if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.